Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini. Chris, welcome to our program as our co-host.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. Great to be with you.
Very good. Before we start off, we're going to talk about subprime loan lending that's been going on for a long time. But before we do this, I wanted to mention that I understand that our numbers are still going up, not as fast as we'd like, but we have 130,000 YouTube subscribers. I would say that we're doing pretty well, but we can always do better.
Yes, we hit the number very recently, 130,000 on YouTube. Our social media, Facebook, Twitter, are much bigger, but for everybody that watches this show every day, thank you so much. And I want to echo what Dr. Paul said yesterday. He believes, and I believe too, that the Americans want the truth. And we state it here plainly every day. So thank you. And if you could share with anybody else that's interested in the truth, please do so.
Very good. And we want to talk about a subprime bubble that's going on because there's been specific articles out, one by our friend Simon Black and the other by Peter Schiff. But then again, how do you cover all the bubbles? Because, you know, the nature of what the Fed does by manipulating interest rates to lower than the market rate, everything has to be affected to some degree by a bubble and a distortion and a malinvestment and excessive debt. But the two of them have been warning about an automobile bubble, and there's evidence now that is showing, as well as there's still going to be another housing bubble, maybe not exactly like it was 10 years ago, but there may be some surprises out there, because once you get involved in destroying the most important measuring rod for people to make decisions in business and investment, and that is the real interest rates. The market rate of interest tells you a whole lot, at least in a free market economy. So we have a mixed bag. We don't have a free market economy, so it might be less important. You just have to guess what the Fed is going to do. But in a free market, it tells you about savings. In a free market, capital comes from savings, but not when you have a Federal Reserve dealing with a fiat system that's been around for 40 years. It's irrelevant, except for the fact that everything they do is going to have mistakes. But Chris, you've looked at this a little bit, and I think that there's pretty good evidence that there is a automobile financing bubble there, and that there are signs that it's starting to burst, and it may be the beginning of a serious downturn in our economy.
Yes, when I saw that subprime is back, it's almost unbelievable, because when you think back to 2008, when Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, they're all falling like dominoes. So not only do they harm us tremendously and economically, but they're self-defeating. They destroy themselves. So if you think back, that was only 10 years ago, that they would not only do it again, but do it on an even bigger scale. It just makes you wonder where their heads are. But they're addicted to creating new money into credit, and this is what it looks like. And not only in auto loans, but in subprime mortgages, once again, Dr. Paul.
You know, maybe our title is too narrow, because when you think of it, it says our title is "The Fed Never Learns." I think a lot of our viewers will agree with us there. And even if they did, they're incapable of managing it. It's a job. No matter how sincere they would be, they just can't do it because they're trying to substitute the market. But just think of the other people that never learn. How did the Congress contribute to the market, the subprime market in housing? With the Community Reinvestment Act and telling that they had to make loans. So it is out there. And there's many bubbles. And what about Congress? When the crisis finally hits, and that's what we're suggesting now that we're getting close to another one, Congress gets involved. Oh, they're too big to fail. We're not going to do it. And nobody believes that. You know, if you're big, you're going to be bailed out. And the only thing they know in Washington, those are the politicians. So they haven't learned either. I haven't come across very many that deal with it. They try to say that, yes, you're right, there's mistakes. And they acknowledge that. Even when we dealt with the bailouts before, yes. But the answer is not going to free markets and reining in the Fed. It's to take the mistakes of the Fed and take all the mistakes that business people make and solve the problem by more regulation. the regulations were already out there, and it compounded the problem. And this, of course, is what Austrian economics teaches, that when you put a regulation out there, there's going to be new problems. Then you have to correct those. And so I see no sign that they've learned anything, whether it's the Federal Reserve, whether it's the economic advisors, whether it's the congressmen. They're still locked in on Keynesian economics. They're locked in on a dollar that is pure fiat, and it's been that way for a long time, and they don't want to deal with the bubble. How about the bubble in Congress, and the bubble of debt? Debt bubble probably is one of the biggest bubbles that we're going to be dealing with. So there's a lot of learning yet to do, and it's hard to justify my statement, but I do believe it, that we are spreading the message on free market economics and anti-Fed propaganda, because the Fed is not a viable institution. So I think it's out there, but we're not on the verge of next month being able to dictate monetary policy and have a commodity standard. That's not likely to come. But the more we can get the people to understand what subprime means and how dangerous it is, I think the better we'll all be.
Yes, and while things may look rosy, things can also fall apart very quickly. As I mentioned, the Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, in a blink of an eye, they were gone. I mean, who would have thought that those names that have been around forever and were so trusted and had so many trillions in assets and they were just gone. So that's why it's important to understand things ahead of time, because you don't have time to think once it comes down. And just to touch on the bailouts, Dr. Paul, what you mentioned, I think the canary in the coal mine was when long-term capital management was bailed out in 1998, because that gave a signal that, you could take as much risk as you want, and the taxpayer and the Fed will be there for you. And only 10 years later, we got TARP, which was such a massive ripoff of the taxpayers that even the average American took notice. And there was Occupy Wall Street and a lot of outcry. But here we are another 10 years later, and we have an even bigger bubble than those. And for sure, they believe that they're going to be bailed out again.
And the bailout is going to be there, and they're going to try. But I think your point of speed is important. Things move rapidly. And on the last go-around, it was so rapid they couldn't save it. It was like the building was burned down before they could infuse enough new artificial cash in order to bail them out. So speed is important. And eventually, the whole system, and for me, that I've been talking about is the whole system, when it comes down, when the whole world decides they want to give up on the dollar. I don't believe they're on the verge of that, but that's what eventually it'll lead to, because of what's going on in trade wars and our financial situation with the deficits exploding and the spending exploding and the Congress supporting it. But in those articles we read that even I was surprised a little bit because I don't follow on a daily basis what a new car costs, but the average new car is $31,000. That's a bit. That's more than I paid for my first 3 houses. So that's a good test. But what about the time? Not only the price they're paying, but what about the time? 69 months is the average loan for a car. Maybe what happens after the car's not worth much at 5 months or 5 years? There's no equity in there. And so far, when that has happened, the car companies have been very lenient. The cash is out there. So if they had a 5-year note, they'll take it in and take in the leftover mortgage and roll it into the next one, and they can get the loan. But right now, the market eventually dictates, and I understand there's a lot less people in these showrooms buying cars, and there are some financial companies that support this type of subprime mortgages, and they have gone bankrupt. So the signs are out there, and that's the reason that people should be very concerned about what's happening. And in the old days, what you did was you saved more money. You saved money, and then you could buy things, and that's how I remember. Well, that's the way I bought cars, but I remember my parents bought cars that way. It was never on time, but now it's 6-7 years that you borrow on time, and I guess in a way it doesn't make sense, because it makes moral sense, but it doesn't make economic sense. It does not take free money and you don't have to pay any interest. But I still do not like it. I do not even like paying off the principal. I don't like debt, and it's a shame that that our government doesn't operate the same way. That doesn't mean that legitimate borrowing in a free market is something that you shouldn't be doing, because that is very legitimate. But if it's based on the market, savings and real interest rates, and measuring risk, and not having this moral hazard of the government, saying that we will guarantee your deposits, and if things go badly, we'll guarantee that you're going to get a bailout, even though they won't admit it.
Yeah, and they're very skilled at how they do it. As you mentioned, money, it was invented in the marketplace, and it should go right back to the marketplace. But right now, it's monopolized and with a government-granted monopoly to the central bank, to the Federal Reserve, and they have us on a hamster wheel. It's just a big bubble, and then it bursts. And they have different names. Like when Ben Bernanke was Fed chairman, he came out with quantitative easing, which is just another way of saying we're going to counterfeit money and print money and loan it out. And with this subprime, they have a new name for that too. They don't use subprime. It's non-QM, non-qualified mortgage is what they're using. So it's a hamster wheel, and they just rename it. But they're doing the same exact thing. But each crisis is getting worse and worse and worse, and we should be aware of that.
Yeah, I think we've been advised that we should be cautious with language, because languages can be very deceiving. As if, like, if you change the name, you reduce the disadvantages of having quantitative easing. But it is a mess. And I think that we're talking more about the car industry right now and the excesses there, but they're in the houses too, because some people say, well, it's difficult. The regulations there, it's difficult to get a mortgage these days, and it is. Some people make you fill out a lot of forms, but I also still hear ads on TV that if you come in, we'll we'll give you a new mortgage, and the closing costs will be rolled in, and no deposit. And they're putting that on the ad, so there's a lot of malinvestment out there, and there's a lot of moral hazard, and you can't do that without a Federal Reserve. So bubbles come from the Federal Reserve. They're encouraged by the politicians, and they're encouraged by the people who like to get easy money. So it's not only the politicians, individuals probably early on thought, well, it's good, I'm going to get a house mortgage, and I didn't have to save much money because they got their house sooner. So on the short run, it looks good, but on the long runs, it runs out of steam. And Chris, I think that's what we're witnessing today, and what we're concerned that we're seeing more of these signs that this system today, the fiat dollar system, is running out of steam. And when we see these examples of bubbles bursting, that is just a warning sign that a very big bubble may burst in the near future.
Yes, and that's how I'll finish, Dr. Paul. When the bubble bursts, we already know how it's going to be portrayed. It's the fingers are going to be pointing outward. It's going to be China, Syria, whatever is in the news of the day. It's going to be someone else's fault, and we're going to need to give the government more power so that they can save us, because there's no way we're going to save ourselves. That they've told us plenty of times. But that's the problem is not outwards. It's what Ron Paul has been saying since at least 1976. It's with the monetary system, which has finances the welfare state and the warfare state, which are now at unconscionable levels. They're unbelievable, both of them. So we need real money again, not central banking. And hopefully our show helps at least get the ideas in people's minds that that's a direction we need to go.
Very good. And I think your point about eventually about having the monetary reform is good, and we're moving in that direction. It will be unnecessary, and actually history's on our side. This isn't the first time people have done this. I think it's the biggest bubble that has ever occurred with fiat money ever in the history of the world, and therefore it's going to be a big problem. But it happens frequently over the many hundreds of years, if that's not thousands of years. But to restore order and to restore confidence, they've always had to go back to something the people can trust and check on, and that is getting rid of fiat, getting rid of this dictate by government or central bank and say, this is legal tender. That's why why in my stint in Congress, I always introduced a bill that legalized competing currency, not dictating and saying this is what you must use, but legalizing the choices that could be made, because gold and silver was not picked by government, but it was developed in the marketplace, but quickly. After it was introduced, the governments wanted to take over and monopolize it and then abuse it and counterfeit it and use it to their advantage. And they can get away with it for a long time. I'm surprised that the total destruction of any link to gold with the dollar in 1971 has lasted this long. And it's still at the point where you can't say, well, we have another month left or another year. I don't think anybody can say that. But it's possible that things can move rather quickly because others are thinking about gold, more so than the Western countries, but the Far Eastern countries. And you can see that in the hostility toward America. And this does work into foreign policy because there's a lot of hostility toward us and some of these trade arguments. Trade fights are so often a result of fiat currency and currency wars originate in trade wars, and then you have the hot wars that come afterwards. But that is what has happened. And one tool that they can have, and it's been threatened with, is somebody like China or India or Russia or people getting together and having an alternative to the dollar. And many of us think that has motivated some of our stupidest mistakes in foreign policy, such as in Iraq and Libya and other places, because they threatened, to use something other than the dollar, and that would have been very detrimental. So even in foreign policy, the dollar is a very important thing to talk about. History shows that eventually to get confidence back in the currency is that commodity convertibility is a necessity. So we'll wait and see, but in the meantime, we're going to do our best to understand to the best of our ability on what is happening and what it means and why it makes a lot of sense to have a sensible foreign policy where we don't waste finances and wealth and people, and also to have a domestic economic system that makes sense. And that can't make sense until you get rid of the Fed and get rid of this monopoly control over interest rates. And that's essentially what we've been talking about here. Subprime, everything is subprime when the Fed dictates interest rates at 0 or 1%, when the market would have been 3, 4, or 5%. Besides, it's a moral issue. They're stealing, it's theft. They're destroying the whole principle of frugality. Save and take care of yourself. Save for a rainy day. Save to send your kids to college. They destroy that. They want you to be totally dependent on the government. And that has happened. Now that we're dependent, the government's not going to be able to afford to come through and take care of the needs of the people. It's an important message, and we're going to keep working on promoting that message to understand it so that we can come up with the best correction. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.